Hey everybody, it's Jason with Parallel Reality coming back with you here today with an article from May 19th from the Daily Signal, and it is the truth about the 1968 Democrat Convention. And this is something that, being a Chicago suburbanite, because God forbid I say I'm from Chicago to make it just easier to say, because I am not actually from the city proper. That would be my mom and my dad, and I am from the suburbs. But again, this was, something that's kind of local lore sort of thing that I don't really know a whole heck of a lot about, other than there was some shenanigans that were going on during that 1968 Democrat National Convention. So I figured, what the heck? Let's give this a shot and read about it and see what it has to say. Maybe I'll learn something. So, clearing my throat, it says, we will see a repeat this summer of the infamous 1968 Chicago Democratic National Convention that devolved into chaos and anarchy. Or says, will we see that? It should have been a question. It says, this year's convention is, like 1968, set to take place in Chicago, and social unrest is percolating on the left, to say the least. In a recent interview on Fox News, Representative Dean Phillips, Democrat of Michigan, who challenged President Joe Biden in a Democratic presidential primary, said that given our current course of events, history is likely to repeat itself. And he said, quote, I'm afraid this is looking awfully like 1968 with a lot of anger and angst and disenfranchisement that I think are going to play out on TV this summer, and it's going to be awfully contentious, end quote, Phillips said on Wednesday. The 1968 anti-Vietnam War and other far-left protesters descended on the Windy City to protest the party's presidential nominating convention. And there's a picture there. The situation escalated when then Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, who we know plenty about around here, says a Democrat had enough and unleashed the Chicago Police Department on the protesters. The media at the time strongly criticized the Chicago Police Department, but many Americans strongly sympathized with the authorities who desperately sought to restore order. The events of the convention likely swayed a lot of voters concerned about violent radicals taking over their cities. Many in the media sided with the protesters, while the American people largely sided with the police. The chaos was likely one of the reasons Republican Richard Nixon defeated Democrat Hubert Humphrey in November 1968. Pre-election chaos created by the left led to the silent majority delivering Nixon a resounding victory. Given the protest we've seen across the country in recent months and the pressure the left is putting on Democrats over Israel's war in Gaza, it's hard not to think that this year's Democratic Convention could see similar protests. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson has said that safety is a top priority for the convention, but he's hardly the law and order mayor that Daley was. In fact, Johnson has supported defunding the police, has openly sympathized with the anti-Israel protesters, and even made it clear that he's nothing like Daley. And in this case, that's kind of a bad thing. And this guy is over his head. He was over his head when he was elected, and it's just one of those guys that's just in there to make things worse, basically. And the author of the article says, as my colleague Tony Kinnett noted, Johnson has said he's a different kind of Democrat. Yes, he's a leftist. He's not a Democrat at all, really. In a certain sense, Johnson's attitude is a sign that in the long term, the new left factions that protested in Chicago in 1968 won. And says more on that later. While prominent Democrats and members of the media insist that 2024 won't be like 1968, it's difficult not to see that a storm is potentially brewing. There have already been significant protests at Chicago universities. Pro-Palestine groups have sprung up around the city, some sprouting chants like Death to America, and a large group of anti-Israel protesters raised a Palestinian flag near where the Democrat Convention is set to take place August 19th through 22nd. Oh, I didn't even know what that's when it was. That's 3 months from right now, as a matter of fact, from when I'm recording this. It says there's no question that Democrats are already getting nervous about what might happen, as they should be, given what we've seen. The 1968 convention was a seminal moment in both the history of the Democratic Party and the United States. It signaled a long-term takeover of the party and various other institutions by the new left. Given that the comparisons will continue to be made, it's worth looking back at what happened 56 years ago. God, that 1968, God, people born in 68 were 56 years old now? Jesus age. All right. Made me feel really old there for a minute. I wasn't born in the 60s. I was born a decade after that, but still, I just didn't think about it that way. This is New Left organizes to sow chaos. So in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson had elected not to seek a second term despite winning in a landslide in 1964. Even though the Vietnam War had been conducted by Democratic presidents, the party had turned in an anti-war direction. This became a flashpoint for a party that had become increasingly divided. The common narrative of the Chicago Democratic National Convention in the years that followed was that it was a mostly peaceful protest of the Vietnam War, broken up by a brutish and out-of-control Chicago police force. Isn't everything the left does mostly peaceful, and it turns out to be anything but that? I would have to say, yeah. So it says that's not exactly accurate, and I guessed that was the case. Says the reality is that the well-organized protesters were looking to pick a fight to bolster their cause, as historian Stephen F. Hayward described in his book, The Age of Reagan, The Fall of the Old Liberal Order, 1964 to 1980. The Chicago police reacted to a calculated provocation, Hayward wrote, and like the case of fighting school children, where the second child to strike a blow is the one usually caught by the teacher, the media caught the police reaction and attributed it as the cause of the violence. That's a good way to put it, I guess. Hayward explained how plans to disrupt the convention began as early as December 1967 and were the product of three main groups. Those groups were the Youth International Party, or the Yippies. That doesn't sound very threatening. Wasn't that the name of the Montreal Expos mascot? No, that was Youppi. Okay, never mind. That's where my brain went. So the Yippies. All right. The National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, or MOB, and the Students for a Democratic Society, and I'm guessing those are probably leftists given their name, the SDS. The factions had slightly different agendas for what they wanted to pull off in Chicago. The MOB generally wanted a peaceful protest to take place, though it wasn't exactly adverse to causing mayhem and potentially violence. It would be a mistake to think that the fight against the war can be won in the ballot box, said MOB leader David Dellinger. It has to be won on the streets. Someone with that close of a last name, Dillinger, in Chicago? Well, all right. No, there are no coincidences, right? As the Yippies wanted something more like a giant street festival. They announced a plan to put LSD in the Chicago water supply. Oh, that would have gone over real well. Chlorine treatment of the water would have neutralized any threat to the Chicago population, but the Chicago police took the threat seriously enough to put officers in front of the city's filtration plants. I didn't know that about chlorine. It can actually do that? Okay, cool. Learn something new every day. It says the Students for a Democratic Society were looking for a fight. So here's our leftists. Says Hayward noted that the reason the SDS was looking to ratchet up violence is that they saw liberal anti-war presidential candidates like Robert F. Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy as a threat. For leaders of this movement and others on the far left, the entire American system needed to be overthrown. Yep, these are definitely our leftists. They weren't looking for peace in Vietnam. They were looking to overturn the American way of life and government. While the three factions plotted different tactics to achieve their goals, they were nevertheless united behind a larger agenda. They wanted to sow chaos as much as possible so that they could eventually shove their more moderate cohorts on the left side and take the reins of power. They wanted to agitate, disrupt, and put the most pressure possible on Democrats to bend to their will. Humphrey frequently mentioned on the campaign trail that he wanted to bring the politics of joy to the country. There's politics is okay. That just seems like an odd thing. Politics of joy. What would that be? It says the activists are having none of it. We are coming to Chicago to vomit on the politics of joy. SDS leader Tom Hayden wrote before the convention. Excuse me, not cutting that out. To expose the secret decisions, upset the nightclub orgies, and face the Democratic Party with its illegitimacy and criminality. Okay there, champ. The days of rage. Given the other events of 1968, and I think everybody knows what they're referring to there, it isn't hard to see why the Democratic Convention became a mess in hindsight. Two riots had already taken place in Chicago earlier in the year. Civil rights leader, and this is what I was referring to just a moment ago, civil rights leader, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot in April, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June. Many college campuses had been in turmoil in the spring. Student protesters had practically shut down Columbia University and occupied Hamilton Hall before being cleared out by the New York Police Department in late April. Yes, I'm still talking about 1968 here, not 2024. I was going to make a joke about that, but the article beat me to the joke. It says, by August, the mood was still deeply unsettled. The Democratic race came down to Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine. While the party had conceded a great deal to the anti-war wing, it wasn't nearly enough to appease the activists. There were late attempts to move the convention to Miami, but they didn't come to fruition. Johnson, who remained a powerful influence on the party, was alleged to have said that Miami is not an American city. The show went on. The 1968 convention was set to take place for 4 days in Chicago's International Amphitheater, starting on August 26th. Before the events kicked off, protesters began gathering in the city. Daley was hesitant to issue permits to the protesters, but consented to let them gather miles from the convention in Lincoln Park. He then changed his mind and ordered Chicago police to implement an 11 p.m. curfew. And again, while many of the about 12,000 protesters showed up in the city likely wanted to conduct a peaceful protest, the organizers knew that it would be easy to manipulate the situation to initiate violence. More from Hayward. The hardcore leaders of the left knew it would be easy to manipulate the situation into a violent confrontation with police and be able to blame the police. Chicago's police were notoriously aggressive toward protesters and rioters. Daley had famously ordered his police to shoot to kill arsonists and looters during the riots that followed King's assassination in April. It should be noted, however, that no one was shot during the convention riots. Well, that's good. Once the protesters had been pushed out of Lincoln Park, all hell began to break loose as the protesters violently clashed with police, who used tear gas and billy clubs to disperse the crowd. It wasn't just police clashing with the protesters. Daley brought thousands of National Guardsmen into the city, too, with the governor's consent. Oh, this is going to be a fun time. This violence continued to ramp up around the city as the protesters continued to clash with police, and members of the media got caught up in the melee, whatever. This August 28th saw the most significant day of violence at the so-called Battle of Michigan Avenue, which was televised live. That night, Humphrey secured the nomination as police clashed with protesters who had attempted to march on the convention. It says, authorities put up barricades around the convention site and tightened up security even further for the final day of the convention, where protesters twice tried to get into the convention hall but were rebuffed. Hundreds of protesters and police officers suffered injuries during the scrums, and authorities arrested more than 650 people. So that's just not even really a dent in the 12,000 that showed up. But I'm sure all of them weren't actually people trying to do this. Otherwise, the CPD would have been completely overwhelmed. So though many prominent Democrats blamed Daley for the violence that took place, Daley naturally disagreed. He argued that calling on the police and National Guard was necessary to suppress people who were intentionally creating violence and disorder. Daley gave a speech addressing what had happened, and he said, in the heat of emotion and riot, some policemen may have overreacted, he said, but to judge the entire police department by the alleged action of a few would be just as unfair as to judge our entire young generation by the action of this mob. As Daley further said that while he didn't condone any violent actions, he also would not permit a group of violent terrorists to menace the lives of millions of people, destroy the purpose of this national convention, or take over the streets of Chicago. And then we get to the aftermath. SDS leader Hayden said that the result of the Chicago protest was 100% victory and propaganda, and said he hoped what would happen in Chicago would be repeated around the country whenever Humphrey showed up at a campaign stop. From the perspective of the new left activists, the chaos was seen as a victory. The fact that several prominent members of the media were injured in the events was a bonus that would lead to sympathy and positive coverage for their cause, or so they said. But attitudes around the country were hardly universal. Most Americans sided with Daley and the police over the activists, and many thought the police should have been even more proactive. A poll taken shortly after the riots found that 71% of Americans thought Chicago's security measures were justified, 57% thought the police had not used excessive force, while 25% thought the police had not used enough force, Hayward wrote. In a sense, both the activists and their most stalwart opponents benefited politically from the Chicago Convention. The moderate wing of the Democratic Party continued to lose power and influence. The party was forever changed by what had transpired, and popular narratives took hold that the activists were on the right side of history while the authorities were simply reactionaries. On the flip side, a rising coalition on the right, fed up with the urban chaos and international agitation, would deliver the White House in a landslide to Nixon. And I believe that, is in fact the end of the article. Okay, I didn't know a lot about that stuff. I kind of obviously knew this happened, but I didn't really know some of the details there. I can't really say I'm surprised that leftists wanted to try to do some bad stuff. Kind of the same thing it is now. So if you're someone out there that's older that remembers this, let me know about this, or like what your memories of this were, especially if you're in the Chicagoland area or were at the time. Be very interested in hearing that. But other than that, let me know what you think about this as a whole in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.